Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I was just told 5 seconds ago that I have to give an introduction. I'll keep that very brief because you all came here to listen to the world famous author Douglas Murray. Welcome to you all at City Hall. You are in the marriage room now, Mr. Murray. In the 16th century there was no marriage room because civic marriage didn't exist yet. People only married in church. And in the 19th century this was refurbished as a marriage room and dedicated to marriages throughout time, the ancient times, Roman times, Christian times, modern times, and then the French Revolutionary times. And if you look at what we call the fil rouge of marriage, is that it makes people look very unhappy throughout all the ages. The painter never married himself, but he hid a secret message about marriage in this room. It's a room where we invite all famous people. Willem of Orange walked through this room, Winston Churchill was in this room, Napoleon was in this room. Now you are in this room. Only the most important people come here, people that we like to listen to. You are the author of some world best-selling books that I thoroughly enjoyed reading and that of course inspired a lot of controversy as well, which makes them even more interesting. So we'll have a nice debate. We'll let Mr. Murray speak as much as we can. You know, I'm a politician, I like to hear myself speak, but this evening we have 1 hour. It's a unique opportunity to hear Mr. Murray speak. Please welcome him in City Hall and let's kick it off.
Good evening, Mr. Murray. Do you like the French edition?
I do. I just wrote
Is
the
this
first time.
first time you saw it?
Yes.
Yes. Let me first ask you, in English, it's the war of the West.
Yeah.
You know what the aanval of the West means?
Yeah.
It's more like an attack. Is it just, does that difference stand for anything?
You
You have to.
No, yeah.
does this work?
It doesn't.
I don't know if that works. I think I have to record it, so I think I have to. Yeah.
I think that I'll just do it.
Yeah.
I think that the distinction may be without difference. I don't know. All translations of my books have slight variations. I know that when I wrote my book on migration, Strange Death of Europe, it came out in France as Le Suicide Européen, which was slightly stronger than the English one. I have no say on translation.
Yeah. Does that have anything to do with the fact that in America and Great Britain, where you come from, it's more war than it is, for example, in Belgium and the Netherlands?
Well, that's quite possible. I mean, you will know the situation in Belgium and the Netherlands much better than I do. But essentially what I describe in the book is what I regard as being an all-out conflict on all of the sources of Western civilization. Lest anyone think that I'm overstating it, I really do give chapter and verse in this book. I think it's a movement that started in recent decades, but it's sped up exponentially in recent years. And when I say a war on everything, again, I'm not overstating it. A war on, particularly in America, it has to be said, in the English-speaking democracies, it's worse, in my view. But it's the war on everything to do with the foundations. So, in Britain, the people who are most attacked are the people who we most revere. The mayor mentioned Winston Churchill. If you were trying to persuade people in Britain to come onto your movement, you would think that attacking the most famous and revered hero of Britain would be unwise. But this movement doesn't think that at all. It goes straight for Churchill. Same thing in America. You would think if you wanted to get people on your side with a political movement or a political project, you would not attack the founding fathers. Yet it is Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and the rest who are all being daily attacked in the United States. And what I stress about this is, don't mistake this as simple historical revision or historical to and fro. I am all for that. I welcome it. I think that we always reapproach the past and through different lenses. We reinterpret it and we look at it anew, and that's as it should be. But looking at our past through solely hostile lenses is a very peculiar thing to do. I actually know of no other society that's engaged in this form of self-flagellation. Again, it's different from self-criticism. Self-criticism in any liberal democracy is absolutely vital. We should be self-critical. but so self-critical that you say there's nothing good about yourself? Now, maybe I overstate that in Belgium. Maybe in Belgium you still have things you cohere around, and I see them there shaking his head, and I think, but no, maybe
Doing that just a couple of seconds ago as well.
a lot can be said without a microphone. But maybe it's better here. But I can assure you that in America, where I live, this is nothing is good in the past. The country shouldn't have been found. Christopher Columbus shouldn't have set out, or he should have set out, and once he found America, should have gone back to Spain and Portugal and said, "I didn't find it." Or there's a large amount of land, but it has no potential. Once you decide, for instance, that your society has an original sin, which is now accepted by sort of left and right in America, everyone says, well, the original sin of slavery. And I always say, well, what's the original sin of other countries? Does everyone have one, or is it just you? What's the original sin of Uganda, for instance? Or are they endemic in some way? And when I state it like that, the point I'm trying to bring across is, it is a war on the foundations, and the people waging it have chosen their targets well, because they've gone right for the root of the building. The very thing that society was proud of, the things that people used to cohere around, they're the targets. It's not fringe bits and pieces around the edges, it's the absolute center of the being of a society like America or Britain, and possibly that.
I'm going to ask the same question to the mayor, because I saw what he said in the first
In approval.
couple of minutes. Yes. But the difference, Mr. Mayor, between a war and an attack, I was thinking, is it possible that it's worse in America? Because you have read the book, I think last year, it was your favorite book from 2022. I've read it this week, and I was asking myself, is it worse in America and in Great Britain than it is here with us? But you say no.
Well, I think that's funny, because Mr. Murray came into my office, we had a coffee, and the first thing he asked me, is it just as bad here? Because I think in English-speaking countries, it's probably worse. And I had to contradict you. It came over the ocean quite rapidly. We are copying the attack on Western society in Flanders as well. And one of the theses that I defend in a modest book that I showed you is that it's actually nowhere worse than here. Flemish identity, the attacking of our past, it's an obsession. We had a television show, popular television show that aired, The Story of Flanders, where in a popular way historians told the narrative of all things that happened here. The reaction of the intellectual elite, the academic scholars, historians, was furious. They called this North Korean propaganda television. It was an outrage. The idea of telling people their history in a way that it is a story that they can comprehend, that does not deconstruct things or destruct things, but simply tells a story that might provide a sense of community, maybe even a sense of pride, is an absolute outrage.
Wasn't that a small group of academics?
Oh, but this is fueled by a very, very small portion of the population. But they are, of course, very present in the humanities of our universities. They're very present in the redaction floors of our main quality media, who are present here today, and they're certainly omnipresent in what we call culture makers. There are people who think differently, but they're wise and they shut up. Because speaking out against this way of thinking is very dangerous, because you will get cancelled. And cancelling is something very, very, if that happens to you, it crushes you. And so people are either, if I have a sympathizer in the cultural world, they exist. Very often they articulate their sympathy when I go to the toilet. They follow me in the corridor, not in the toilet, but they follow me in the corridor, and then they tap me on the shoulder and say, I'm all for you, in a whisper. Yeah. But they wouldn't dare to repeat that if the colleagues in the cultural world would hear it.
Whenever anyone does that to me, as it were, tap on the shoulder and the whisper, I agree with you, I just can't say it. I always say, I see, you're a coward.
That's fair.
I was asking you a question because on a scientific level, I was going to the universities and all that, I was wondering, do we have the same problem? Because maybe, first of all, can you describe what happens at, for example, Cambridge and Oxford that people know what we're talking about? Because I was quite shocked to read all about that.
Yes, I mean, these are, of course, the Academy, as I call it in America, has had endless books written about it and its oddities in recent decades. But the universities, great universities like Oxford and Cambridge, are just going through the same boring list of American cultural obsessions as everyone else. Cambridge University recently ordered an inquiry into whether the university had benefited from the slave trade historically. First of all, of course, when you set up an inquiry like that,
Sorry to interrupt you. How does that happen? What is the process?
the process is you get a set of pseudo-historians who are normally ignoramuses with deep grudge to look at your past and find you guilty, because they do always find you guilty. Such things are never set up, and people, it's like setting up there was a recent thing in the English countryside. The main English countryside trust ordered an inquiry as to whether they benefited from colonization. And of course they get some jaundiced people who look at the English countryside and say, yes, it is indeed racist. And they're always going to find that, because that's what they're set up to do.
Mm.
They were never set up. It's like going into a court as a defendant and finding that the judge has dismissed the jury, wants to go straight on to sentencing, and is wearing a black cap. In other words, they've already found you guilty. It's merely a process, rather like you know, a court in former Eastern Europe. They've decided we are guilty, and then the question is simply what we do about it. And almost every institution has gone through this. Museums are one of my obsessions. I'm a great lover of the arts, and I find, for instance, that almost every major collection, certainly in America and in Britain as well, and possibly again here, is being reevaluated. Again, there's nothing wrong with reevaluating the past in art. But when it means, as it does at Tate Britain, for instance, that you have artists' works, a great work like Stanley Spencer's Resurrection at Cookham, and you have beside it this description of Stanley Spencer that effectively accuses him of racism, because there was nobody black in his village in England in the 1920s when he painted it. It's really quite something when you're not merely recontextualizing your collection, you're attacking it. I mean, they found, and this is one of my obsessions that comes across in the culture chapter in the book, Tate Britain, again, just to take one example, has closed a room with a mural by the great pre-war artist Rex Wisner. It found that there is a single character in a corner of this beautiful mural done in the 1920s that is of a child, a black child, being led in chains by a woman in a frilly dress who's laughing. Clearly, for anyone who understands this, the message of this is something like et in Arcadia ego. But the Tate didn't bother to work that out. They just found it guilty of racism, said that Rex Whistler was a racist, and closed the room. And here's one reason I mind that. Rex Whistler had no children, and there's no one to defend him, because he died on his first day fighting in Normandy in 1944. How dare these people stand in such judgment on everything in the past? They're not qualified to do it. And yet in institution after institution, it's what they're doing.
Well, if I can go back to the universities, like for us, Oxford, Cambridge, big names in the world, what happens if very intelligent people start like spreading fake news? That is what you are describing,
Yes.
isn't it?
Well, yes, it is. I mean, for instance, there's a course, I was at Oxford myself some years ago. And in actual fact, I was saying to the mayor, it was the last time I was here in this very hall, about 20 years ago at my college. At Oxford, a very, very serious ethicist called Professor Nigel Bigger. He's Regius Professor of Ethics at Oxford University. That's quite a good title to hold. You know, this is somebody you should listen to. The Regius Professor of Ethics decided, after a discussion of colonialism in the last decade got very, very out of hand, said we should at Oxford University set up a course to study the ethics of empire. That was all. To study the ethics of empire. We've got to work out what this was. We're clearly in the middle of some kind of reapproach to it, but how do we do it? We can't simply allow the voices who say there's no difference between, for instance, colonialism and Nazism to just keep getting away with that, because that won't do. And nor would it do if somebody came along and said everything about colonialism was wonderful, why don't we do it again? Of course not. But there's somewhere in the middle you've got to explore, surely, if you would really want to get to some kind of reckoning with our past, a truthful reckoning rather than a hostile reckoning. And yet, for suggesting that this should be done, Professor Nigel Biggar was defamed, among other things, by fellow colleagues as a racist and as being pro-empire. He had endless attempts to cancel him from his job. Fortunately, he's at the end of his career and didn't really care very much, which is something which I wish more people felt. But as I said at the time, defending him, if you're going to weigh up a complex issue like the ethics of empire, were there any good things? What were the bad things? Where did it go wrong? Where might there have been things that were right? Or just to say it happened, like all of history, it happened. If you can't have that discussion at Oxford University, where do you want it to happen? And the truth is that the people saying we don't want it there don't want it anywhere, because like the 1619 project, if I just very quickly explain what that is, the New York Times a few years ago launched a project called the 1619 Project that claims that America was founded in 1619. The stated aim of the 1619 Project is simply to shift the founding date of America to the date that the first slaves were brought onto the continent by the Europeans. But that is all it is for. And very quickly, if I may make this point, the reason that they have run so fast with this is that they make assertions that are provably wrong about the American past, but refuse to debate them. The author of the 1619, Nicole Hannah-Jones, always says, I refuse to platform my opponents. And she does. She has not yet put herself forward for any public discussion or debate that is critical.
But
therein lies a lot.
Tell us what happened with the New York Times, since they gradually took away the evidence.
Yes.
But you documented all that. I believe they explained it. I was quite shocked as well.
It is very shocking. The New York Times is regarded as a paper of record in America. And so the main paper reorientating the entire society to be about, we started in sin, slavery was where we started, slavery is the story of our country, rather than a part of the story. They did this, they launched this project, they made this assertion, and promptly lied about what they'd said. I mean, I have the receipts, as it were. They even changed online the language they used and then said, oh no, we didn't say that. You said it, then you just unsaid it and hoped we wouldn't notice. So there's a sort of degree of duplicity in all this as well. But the main thing was to look at everything in current American life through this lens and find America guilty. And that included, one of the contributors wrote that all of capitalism is descended from a plantation. Now, as I point out in The War on the West, the evidence was the hit job, the drive-by shooting in question, was performed by an incredibly inadequate sociologist of incredible obscurity. His evidence was, among other things, that double bookkeeping, the two-column bookkeeping, was used on plantations, and he says in his hit job on capitalism, every day that an American sits down at their desk and uses Word or any program on their computer, they are, knowingly or otherwise, engaging in a system descended from slavery. Now, sometimes you have to wonder where to start with something this stupid. But let me give it a go. One thing he says is that, well, one thing he doesn't know is that bookkeeping was used in ancient Mesopotamia, among other places. This is not something that was invented on the plantation. Secondly, he says that the accurate recording of facts is what these two things have in common. Well, there might be a reason why any system that is accurate might survive longer and better than a system that is not accurate. And you don't need to bring slavery into it. It simply has nothing to do with it. The aim is there, as in most of the other things I'm trying to describe in this book, a simple attempt to say, we've found the source of guilt and we have to tie everything in the society today to it. I think it's an insane project of self-destruction, but I'm amazed that it's been allowed such a clean run, because its claims are, as I demonstrate, I hope, so evidently faulty.
But I still have the question, what could be the motivation, as well as for sort of payment or an institute, a major institute, as the New York Times considered it a lot as that? You say it's an intention. It's intended to formalize the idea that something you're writing, intended to formalize the idea that the US was founded on an original sin. That intention, where do you get that from?
Well, the first thing is that it's completely clear from the various people I quote that they are engaged not in a process of reevaluation, but an act of revenge. I quote at one point a brilliant insight from Nietzsche from the genealogy of morals. He said, people who talk of justice but mean revenge. It's an incredibly pertinent insight for our age. There are a lot of people talking about justice who mean revenge. One of the most influential writers in modern America, known by the name Ibram X. Kendi, has written multiple attacks on America, and one of which he says, the answer to past discrimination is present discrimination. The answer to past discrimination is future discrimination. He makes it perfectly clear. He says, people were prejudiced against in the past, and as a result, we must be prejudiced in the present. What does he mean by that? It's actually, at this stage, really very, very sinister. Because at this stage in a country like America, when this issue comes up, it always gets on the issue of reparations. Reparations is, of course, the idea that you can pay certain communities to alleviate or somehow make up for historical sins suffered by their ancestors. And in America, this obviously means payments from Americans to Black Americans, and if they're descended from slaves. It's an insane idea, because you simply couldn't do it. I mean, you'd have to work out the precise DNA of every American, and among other things, work out with every person, particularly people who are Black Americans, whether they are actually descended from slaves, or whether, as in most of their cases, they're descended both from slaves and slavers. That would be a problem. What do? They get 50% discount? But this idea always follows on. And what's so sinister about it is what you're really talking about is group punishment. And I don't like that for any group. I don't think that it's appropriate. I think that something that did that to Black Americans would be wicked. And I think that if we did it to other Americans, it would be wicked. But it's an obvious intention to divide. And the reason I say that very quickly is because, apart from anything else, the reparations debate is now, in America, not even about transfer of money from white Americans to Black Americans. It's about the transfer, and nor is it the transfer of money from descendants of people who did something bad to descendants of people who were wronged. It's the transfer of money from people who look like people who did something bad to people who look like people who suffered. That is, I should be to say it, an impossible task. And yet, in California, the mayor ordered an inquiry into this, and the inquiry came back once again, you'll be surprised to hear, with the confirmation that America and California had indeed benefited from slavery, and that therefore every Black American in California should be given, I think at one point it was something like $10.4 million. And even the governor of California sort of realized, this might not work. As the great American comedian Dave Chappelle said, the great Black American comedian, he said, if we do get reparations like that, buy shares in Nike.
So, should there be another way to pay off any debts, or are you saying there is no debt left?
Well, let me put it this way. When it comes to my own country of birth, Great Britain, if there is a debt to be paid from what we benefited from in the slave trade or colonialism.
Is there, according to you?
Well, I don't believe in this idea. I don't believe in this concept of moral debt. I think it is, apart from anything else, an entirely anti-Christian idea. In the Christian ethos, we had the idea that the sins of the father were not placed on the shoulders of the son. To live in a society where the sins of the great possible uncle should be put onto the shoulders of their potential relative is insane. By the way, again, very quickly, this is not theoretical. The British Museum, the British Library a few years ago, decided to come up with a list of authors who may have benefited from slavery and put them on a blacklist. One of them was the great late poet laureate Ted Hughes, who died in 1998. I was very fortunate enough to hear him do a poetry recital before his death. Ted Hughes was born in 1934. Why did they find him guilty? Because they claimed that an ancestor of his in the 16th century had been a slaver. Well, actually, Ted Hughes was born in poverty in the north of England in the 1930s, and it turned out the person they claimed was a relative wasn't even a relative. But who are these people who run libraries where you posthumously cancel authors because of associations with people they never knew, and it turned out to be faulty? So I don't like the concept that we do this strange historical retribution on people. But what I would say is, if we are going to do it, let's do it in every direction. Everybody in Africa, Voltaire famously gave one of the greatest attacks on the hideousness of the slave trade in Candide. What many people don't know is that in one of his letters, Voltaire said the only thing even more reprehensible than what the Europeans are doing with the Africans is what Africans are doing to their brother and sister Africans. And if you read the very few memoirs we have, like that of Equiano, a slave who ended up freed and in Britain, who wrote a most fantastic, gripping memoir in the 18th century. If you read his account of his capture in Africa, it was raiding parties from neighboring villages that would go in and steal people. They would steal their fellow Africans, sell them on to a black African slaver, and he might sell them on to the Europeans, or he might sell them on to the Arab slave market, where I think it's thought that, just to throw out some stats very quickly, it's thought that maybe up to 11 million people sold across the Atlantic in the transatlantic slave trade. Hideous trade. It's thought that up to 18 million were sent east into the Arab slave trade. Why do we not know about that? Because the Arabs castrated all of the men and ensured there wouldn't be any more. Now, if the Americans had to pay reparations for the slave trade, what are the Arabs to do? If black Americans are to benefit from payment for something that happened hundreds of years ago, 1 million Europeans were seized by the Barbary pirates in North Africa, were seized from across the underbelly of the Mediterranean, France, now modern-day Italy, and indeed as far away as Cornwall and Ireland in Europe. About 1 million Europeans were stolen from their villages and sold into slavery by North Africans. Okay, is the government of Tunisia going to cough up? Should we demand that the current administration in Libya hands over some cash to us? In Europe? I mean, it would make sense if we're going to start doing this. And what do we do about the people who are descended from the people in Africa who did the slaving? I mean, surely they have to pay. Surely we've got to squeeze money out of Africa. I mean, you see the insanity of this. This is literally a way to divide everyone all the time for the rest of time. Nobody could claim that anything like healing would come from this. And by the way, that's usually the point of reapproaching history, is to say, let's find a way to approach it in a reasonable light so that we can reasonably reflect on the goods and evils of the past. But it's a very strange project.
Yeah. Just want to take it back to our country, Mr. De Wever, because we're talking about reparations, about universities like Oxford and Cambridge, New York Times. I must say that I feel a difference.
Really?
Anyway, you can tell me otherwise, but can you make that comparison, like to our country?
Well, if you talk about the 1619 project of the New York Times, just simultaneously with that project, Knack wrote in an editorial that racist thinking is in the Flemish DNA, which seems to be more or less the same thing. And if you ask, what's the intention behind all this? I think there is an intention. It's not some exaggerated stage in emancipation movements that we will pass on and will wake up to live in a better world where everybody's more equal and so on and so on. The intention is, of course, to attack any metaphysical framework behind our identity. That's the intention. To destroy, after they chased God as community builder of the pre-modern world, now they want to chase national identity, the nation state, as community builder of the modern world, and arrive in a world without identity. And that's why they're so vigorous and why it's such an obsession. Do we have the same thing about slavery? If you walk into the next room, you look at the ceiling, there's a sentence on the ceiling that our ancestors painted in the 19th century, and it says, "In Antwerp zijn mensen vrij en geen slaven." In Antwerp, people are free and not slaves. It comes from a law book that was printed in the 16th century. We were the first city in the Low Countries who had printed law, the Consuetudines Impressa. And it was a printing of oral law that already existed, in which slavery was forbidden. And that law was also applied in Antwerp. We have cases of Portuguese tradesmen coming in, bringing in slaves. One of the slaves ran away. The Portuguese came to the city magistrate and said, "I want him back." They put the question before the High Court of Justice and they said, "Well, no, it's forbidden. The slave is free." And I always notice when I have tour guides, our ancestors were enormously proud in the 19th century, because there's nothing exclusively Western about slavery except the abolition of slavery. Yeah. That's exclusively Western. And our ancestors were extremely proud that we were forerunners of this abolition, that it was already banned here in the Middle Ages. The risk of becoming a slave as Antwerp citizen was bigger than being a slave in Antwerp. A lot of Antwerp citizens have been slaves, because 25% of all the ships, we were a seafaring city on the Mediterranean, were captured by pirates, and you had a high risk of being sold off on the Algiers slave market as a slave. Until the end of the 18th century, there were more white slaves in the world than people of color. And if you ask people, what do you know about slavery? They say, "Oh, we put people on boats transatlantic, it's all our fault, we're the only ones who did it." No, we're not the only ones who did it. Was it bad? Yes, it was bad. Was it terrible? Yes, it was terrible. But it's quite an evident truth to discover that in the past, our ancestors were less nice. Less nice to poor people, people with other sexual orientation, less nice to women, less nice to people of color. But that's true for the entire humanity, not just for us. Saying that the only thing that you can derive from history is a sense of shame, and that you should apologize for 3,000 years, for the 3,000 years of history. Like Mr. Infantino, are you a soccer fan, Mr. Murray? Probably not. You're a cultivated man, so probably not.
No, I can fake it.
Well, the FIFA president, when we went to Qatar for the World Championship, and there was some criticism on the slave labor, nowadays slave labor in Qatar, and said, those Europeans, you have to shut up, because for the 3,000 years of history, so since the attack on Troy, we derailed, and we have to say sorry for 3,000 years more. That's it. Yeah. They silence you. They rob you of any sense of community, any sense of identity, and they make you weak and speechless for the entire rest of the world.
But is that truly like a systemic intention by Knack, for example?
It's not like they're meeting somewhere in secret, huh? But postmodern thinking, of course there's something bigger behind it. It was not illogical after the Second World War that Foucault would proclaim man to be dead. After Nietzsche proclaimed God to be dead, Foucault said man is dead as well, because without God we didn't do much better. We had concentration camps, we had the Gulag. So the ideologies that clinged to nation states like Nazism led us to terrible places. So Foucault said we have to attack any metaphysical framework that creates community, because at the end of the day it's just a question of power. The power of white heterosexual men who have the power, who construct identity just to exclude other people and at the end of the day massacre them. So we have to rob that creative power of community building, and then we will wake up in a much better world where every individual is the measure of him or herself. That's the deconstruction of postmodernity. That created a vacuum, a void, no identity. And that void was filled by woke, saying deconstruction is not enough, we have to destruct. If Western civilization is at the basis of everything that's gone wrong in history, at the basis of everything that is wrong, and will destroy the planet through climate change, that's also our responsibility. Then we have to stop Western civilization in its tracks. And that's the intention. And that has become a way of thinking that is so dominant in all progressive circles that you can find in Europe, that it's not like it shows its face wherever. If you know how to look at it, it shows its face everywhere, every day. I see it every day.
Well, I was going to say that's the crucial thing, is that it's the same record is played everywhere. That's one of the giveaways. Again, the example you may give of this idea that there is something racist in the DNA of a particular people. Apart from the fact, by the way, that that's a very racist claim itself. Apart from that fact, the question again I always have is, compared to who? Compared to what? If you are a black African who go to live in Saudi Arabia, you will be discriminated against because you are of a darker skin than the locals. As I say, to this day, the word for Arab the word for Africans rather, and slave, black and slave, is the same word in Arabic, abid, plural. They literally today describe in the Middle East black Africans using the word slave. In China, I was made aware of this some years ago by a great late colleague of mine who was born there. The words they use to describe Westerners are entirely racist. Words like one of the words translates as ghost, because they think that Western skin is pale, particularly pale, and they describe it as ghost. The point is that Europeans are effectively non-people. Well, that's quite racist, I would have thought. And it's the same across the world. And as you say, you've got to keep in mind with all of this, compared to what? It's a very odd thing that the generations have come along, look at the past and find the past guilty for not being like us. Well, amazingly enough, in the 16th century, not everyone was in favor of gay marriage. Amazingly enough, in the 15th century, not everyone was on board with women having the right to vote, partly because nobody had the right to vote. But, I mean, you can do that process endlessly, but the question is then to what end? And if you wanted to balance it out, again, on an issue like slavery, you would say, okay, our society may have benefited from slavery, but if, in the case of the UK, you have to add in the cost of abolishing the slave trade. Because when King George III signed the Abolition of Slavery Act in 1807, he also had to pay for the Royal Navy to police the high seas, not just to stop British slave trading, which was stopped, but to stop trading of slaves anywhere in the world. And the Royal Navy was still doing this to stop Brazil's slaving into the 1880s. And we lost thousands of sailors, and a massive amount of the national debt was spent abolishing slavery, again, not just across the British Empire, but across the globe. Now, some credit, surely, would be accrued. If you want the debit side, fine, but surely there's some credit accrued. The British public, like the public here, paid much higher taxes on goods after the abolition of slavery, because we were buying goods in foreign markets only from places that were not slaving. So every household in a country like Britain was paying more for goods throughout the 19th century. That would have to be added in. But you never hear that added in, because nobody seems to want to add it in, because it makes it complicated.
I want to go to one example that utterly surprised me in your book by Winston Churchill. Maybe it's a good idea to first explain what happened to him.
Yeah.
He was cancelled.
Well, yes. 20 years ago, we had in Britain the Greatest Britain poll. I think you probably had it here.
Yeah.
A number of countries around Europe.
We had it.
Did it. And there were 10 television programs of the shortness of the Greatest Britain to ever live. Rather unsurprisingly, in 2000, I think it was, the British public voted again. Winston Churchill was the greatest Briton to ever live. I think the only nearest contender was The Unknown Soldier. But it's a very moving idea. Now, 20 years later, bizarrely, an appalling act by a policeman in Minnesota, the killing of George Floyd, leads to this, what I describe in the book, this very swift stampede and importing of a very specific culture war and policing issue in America onto not just everything in America, but everything in the West. And that ended up with the first, well, I actually attended the first BLM protests in London in 2014 to cover it. And I knew then that we were in trouble because about 1,000 people were marching down Oxford Street. And one of the chants in those days was the claim that people said, hands up, don't shoot. It was claimed that an unarmed black American had been shot by the police in Ferguson, Missouri. In fact, it turned out not to be true. But anyway, as in he hadn't put his hands up and then was shot. But anyway, the point is the early protesters of BLM said, hands up, don't shoot. There they were walking down Oxford Street chanting, hands up, don't shoot, all accompanied by unarmed British police officers who couldn't have shot them if they'd wanted to. My point is that there is this importation of something from American culture, which may or may not fit American culture, I don't think it does, but it certainly doesn't fit onto our culture. Before you know it, after the killing of George Floyd, Winston Churchill is suddenly in the cross wires, in the shooting site. And the protesters, the protests in London, started to deface the statue of Winston Churchill. They insisted that he was a racist, he was a colonialist, he was pro-empire, he held views that we don't hold in the 2020s.
And what was that based
on? Well, it's based largely on the fact that Winston Churchill is accused of having Victorian values, which isn't surprising because he was born in Victorian England. It might be odd if you had Victorian values and you were born in Antwerp in 2010, but it wasn't strange if you were born in England in the 19th century. And those values included a belief in empire, a belief that the British were a force for good on the globe and should have an empire, and this was for the betterment of the globe as well as Britain. There are very specific allegations made against him which are totally untrue and which I've proved at some length. But the basic accusation is Churchill was a racist, Churchill was a, a proponent of empire, and they even accuse him of being a genocidist because of the 1943 Bengal famine, when many Indians died because of without getting into details, because of a food shortage, which people now accuse Winston Churchill of being responsible for, when in actual fact all the documents show that he diverted grain from Australia to get to Bengal in time to try to make up for the terrible famine that was going on, that nobody denies went on in Bengal. But these anti-Churchill protesters decided he was guilty of genocide. And then before you know it, and they got there in no time at all, Churchill was as bad as Hitler. Once you are there, you're in an upside-down world where nothing can make sense. But my point is, again, why would you choose this figure of all figures to attack? And the answer seems to me to be because these cultural revolutionaries wish to attack our holiest places.
Of course.
And like all people who desecrate shrines in history, they want to find the places that are most holy. That's why they go for Thomas Jefferson and get Thomas Jefferson's statue removed from City Hall in New York and other places. That's why even the Senate, after the dead of the 2 world wars in Whitehall, was attacked by the BLM protesters. And when the next day some members of the household cavalry, on their own time, young men and women, all sorts of backgrounds, turned up and cleaned the cenotaph of the graffiti on their own time, some of the BLM protesters shouted at them abuse for doing this and said, "You and your precious monuments." And as I say in the book, but yes, we do have precious monuments. We do have holy places. And we have the right to believe in them, to hold dear to them, to find succor and relief from them, and not to have them assailed by people wholly unworthy of them. I think every society has that right, and I think we do too.
Mr. Mayor?
Well, when you talk about the BLM protests in America after the terrible thing that happened to George Floyd, they kind of flew over the ocean, and we saw them here as well. And I thought that was very strange, because it was the first time that I saw the anger of people that had never been slaves against people that never had slaves. People that even can faintly claim to be the offspring of slaves in Europe. People who came in very recent immigrant movements from the 1950s, 1960s, were in the street in anger against a society that accepted them, that had the openness to accept immigrants and gives them more chances than whatever society you can imagine on the world. They were angry at us. And there, of course, you see the other side of the medal. If you destroy your own identity, if you have an obsession with proving that you are a very bad person, that your ancestors were very bad persons, then there must be victims of your identity. And those victims, if you treat them as victims, they will start to behave like victims. And then you are on a very slippery slope towards what I call the worst form of racism you can have, because before you know it, you have people saying, well, learning Dutch in Flanders, well, that's racist. Why would you ask people to learn Dutch? Learn to write and read correctly. Well, that's way too hard for immigrants. You shouldn't ask that. And everything's, even proper mathematics becomes racist. Saying 1 and 1 is 2. Well, that's a Western side of looking at mathematics. There must be other perspectives as well. It's total lunacy. And this has grave consequences. This is the reason why the level of our education, the quality of our education has gone down. Because if somebody is a victim, equality of chance is not enough. It has to be equality of outcome. Equality becomes equity. It's not something you have to work for, not something you have to work. It's something that has to be given to you as a vengeance, as a compensation. And liberty, freedom, becomes the enemy. But freedom is a power tool of the dominant class, of the white males. They use freedom, they have privilege. They use the freedom just to impose norms and values to exclude other people and make them correspond with the way they live and they want and they think. So freedom is bad, and equality is not something you can work on under the cupola of freedom, which we have been doing since the 19th century. You talked about women's rights, gay rights, the Flemish movement, labor work. They had through generations worked towards equality. No, it has to be given to you. And one of the fastest ways to do that is to take freedom away. The way in the last few decades, how Western society have become less free than they were in the 1960s and 1950s, is very troublesome. It's already in our legislation. The moral high ground that these people take to judge, to condemn, and to cancel in society, but more and more in courts as well, it is really undermining, in my view, democracy and any sense of justice and fairness.
Can you imagine a figure in Belgium or Flanders like Winston Churchill?
Oh, you name him.
That gets the same treatment?
I would say Hendrik Conscience, because there's no people that owes more to one author than the Flemish people in their symbols. And of course, Conscience was not a scientific historian. He wrote a narrative that was directed towards the 19th century Flanders, which was a very, very poor country, second-rate citizens with no language rights. And he said, I want to make a better Belgium, not a better Flanders, a better Belgium, by promoting the Germanic side of the country and saying this is valuable as well. And he wrote stories that people read, that were read to people, saying we have an identity, we have a history to be proud of. He was, of course, as you say, the first pillar they wanted to attack. He has been degraded to a second-rate Heimat writer with no literal qualities, who wrote lunacies about historical facts.
Who's doing that?
Well, I can name a few, but maybe that's not the most useful answer I can give you. At a certain point, after postmodernity turned into woke, these kind of attacks became the most logical thing you can do. Because as you said, if you want to destroy a house, if you would like to destroy this city hall, it's in the cellar that you have to start. Look for the pillars, look for the foundations. What are the stories people tell each other from generation to generation who give you a sense of identity, a sense of pride? Attack those stories. Attack Zwarte Piet. You don't know him in England? Oh, you do know him. You don't know him. Well, attack him. Because why is he so useful to attack? Can a tradition change? Yes, it can change. Society changes and traditions change as well. If it's an organic process, it's a dialogue. If there's consensus about it, I'm not worried about the appearance of Black Pete. But the way they attacked him is simply saying, your childhood was racist. Your parents were racist. Your culture is racist. Your grandparents were parents were racist. That's what they're saying. You have to feel guilty about your ancestry, about everything that you are, and you have to let go of it. That's what they're aiming for. That's why they're attacking conscience.
The fact that he's been called Rude Pete now, is that a sort of a surrender?
I wouldn't call it a... I would have been more happy if that would have been the result of a more consensual dialogue. But I don't consider it illogical that traditions change. If a tradition doesn't change, it becomes folklore. It has to keep a meaning. And of course, if you are a city that is diverse, we have to make it work. It's what you write in your book as well. Whether you like it or not, you have to make it work. My idea of making it work is creating a community and inviting people around the table to participate in the dialogue that creates community, creates identity. And these people have a say as well. And if they say for my child, it would be better if he is unable to let to believe that this Black Pete is somebody to ridicule my child, that would be nice. We're pretty friendly people. If you would have asked this in a nice way, was okay, why not? Huh? Santa Claus used to have a cross. He used to be a purely Catholic figure. Mostly now he has lost his cross because we're not so Catholic anymore. And so traditions can change, they can evolve, but it's the narrative behind the way they attacked that bothers me a lot, and that tells a lot about this aggressive movement.
Let me just add one thing to that, if I may. Imagine what we might be doing if we weren't doing this. It's one of the challenges I tried to put out there. One of my colleagues, Spectator in London, has a great journalistic rule, which I try to follow as well. He says, every single society in history, including our own societies, have done things in the past which we look on with just amazement and often horror. In Britain, an average child in the north where there were mines would be sent into the mines at 10 years old. The average life expectancy in those communities for a man was 28. Was that person very free? Were they in control of their lives? They weren't formally enslaved, no. They didn't have it easy. But let me just return to this issue. Every society does things which we look back on with horror. Why don't we assume that we are not superior to everybody born before us? And it is likely we are doing things now that our successors will look on with equal awe and horror. And my colleague's suggestion is, try to work out what they are now and try to stop them preemptively. Let me give you one example. There are more slaves in the world today than there were at the height of the transatlantic slave trade. I've met slaves in my travels in Africa and the Middle East. I've met people born as slaves in the 21st century. This is a horror going on in our time. And if we weren't talking about Black Pete and a whole range of other relatively frivolous issues, we could solve that issue of slavery today. But we don't. Let me throw out one other one. I've recently written a certain amount about euthanasia. I was rather amazed earlier this year when that poor young girl who survived the Brussels airport attack was euthanized. Now, I have to tell you that in America, among other countries, we looked at that story with utter horror. And I would suggest preemptively on behalf of people who come after us, that people may well be surprised that in Belgium in the 21st century, you could not execute a terrorist, but you could kill his victim. Mm. I would have thought most people morally would find there to be something very peculiar in that. But why do we not interrogate ourselves? And the answer is it's harder. It's harder. than looking at anyone who went before us and saying, we're so much better than you.
Maybe just go to the end of your book, because we would like to know how to solve all this. I'll give you 5 minutes.
Well, let me first of all say, you have to answer things at the depth of the charge that has been put before you. I tell a story, it's familiar to anyone in politics, but I was some time ago at a private event, now made unprivate, but anyway, in which a minister in Britain was asked about house building and the fact that young people can't get onto the housing ladder in the UK. And he answered by talking about incredibly specific issues of planning regulation. And I said to his advisor afterwards, you know what, that's such a mistake, because people who can't get on the housing ladder or can't own are likely to become resentful. And resentment cannot be answered by simple tweaking of planning laws. You also have to have a serious answer to a serious thing. Now, our era is filled with resentment. And the problem with resentment is, again, it makes you effectively a victim. You can blame anyone for whatever doesn't go right in your life. And as everybody here knows, we all live lives in which something goes wrong. I mean, our whole lives end in a thing that goes quite wrong. We could be enormously resentful about that and about everything. But I say that we have to answer charges of resentment, which is what underlies all of the things we've been talking about this evening. We have to answer it with something of equal profundity. And the thing that can answer resentment is only one thing, and that's gratitude. It's gratitude. Now, this is an extremely hard thing to feel for some people. Nietzsche, who I referred to earlier, says that the person of resentment has one particular problem in their life, which is that really somebody needs to at some point stand over their life and say, you are right. Somebody has destroyed your life. Somebody has held you back. The person is you. Now, Nietzsche has no idea who can say this. He says this is the hardest thing any human being could ever hear, the least likely thing they want to be told. Nietzsche has an idea that a secular priest could do it. It's unclear really what he meant. But the point is, you'd have to have somebody in the society willing to turn around and say that. If you haven't got everything you wanted, it is possible there are other people who've caused that, but it is equally possible that you have caused that in your life entire. Now, how do you get to a position of gratitude? Let me give you one very practical example. One reason why I feel gratitude for the society I live in and why I don't want it to be pulled apart and dismantled and deconstructed is because I think, on balance, it's good. Why do I think that? It's not for jingoistic reasons or anything else. It's because I've traveled an awful lot on this planet. I've been to some very benighted countries. I've seen some very benighted people and reported and written from some miserable places. And when I'm there, in these places, I always think how lucky I was. And it is luck in one way, simple luck where we're born. But as one European politician said to me some years ago, I think you're wrong, Douglas, on the issue of luck. Because it's not just luck. The fact that the society you are born in is what it is because actually your predecessors made prudent decisions and did things that were better than some decisions made elsewhere. Let me give you one very obvious example. The energy reserves of Venezuela are pretty much the same as the energy reserves of Norway. Sadly, the people of Venezuela, who I don't blame, and my God, what a nightmare that country is in, they made bad decisions with the people they elected, and the people they elected made even worse decisions, and before you know it, the whole thing fell through the floor, and that has happened in the last 10 years. Norway is doing pretty well. We've got a great sovereign wealth fund and much more. So my point is that it's not just luck. It's not just happenstance. But how you make this clearer to people being encouraged to live lives of resentment, I think that is one of the first answers, is to say, compared to what? I have a friend who's a headmistress in a school in London, in a very deprived area. Every child is of an immigrant background, and every child is from a poor background. And they, because of the fantastic teaching at this school, the children at the school have the best imaginable education, and they are outperforming private schools and other schools all the time in exam results. But I once said to my friend, I said, when you have a child who is like really playing up, is there anything you find to be consistently useful to turn their life around? And she said, actually, there is one thing. I encourage their parents to take them back to their country of origin to meet their cousins. Mm. And if you have grown up in London, even in a poor part of London, in the 21st century, you have lots of reasons to feel resentment, as we all do. And you could live a life of resentment. Or you might go to Bangladesh and meet your second cousins and realize that you have some things to be grateful for. The thing about gratitude is that once you can feel it, you discover it's the world's greatest and freest commodity. I walked through the square here tonight, and I say having not been here for 20 years, but with wonderful memories of this city. I looked through the square and said, wow. I could look at the square and I say, now we have to do an audit. What is the guilt of this square? This cathedral spire was almost certainly not built by voluntary labour. Labourers paid a fair day's wage for a fair day's work.
It was.
It's possible it was. Maybe this is so. Maybe the stone was quarried in an unethical manner.
No.
It's possible. It's possible that carbon emissions were let off in the building of that cathedral.
You got me there.
You know, it's possible that there was a carbon footprint that was not offset by the people who built the cathedral.
That's true.
And for this reason, we must look at it as an act of guilt. We could do this all the time. But just stand back and marvel at the works of man. It's a much better way to look at the world. It's like looking at a person. You can always find something wrong with somebody, and find much wrong about myself. But it's a strange way to approach life. It's a much better way to look for the good in people, to find it where you can, to bring it out of people. It's a different way of looking at the world. Now, I have lots of practical things I could suggest other than that, and some people might say that's just too big and too vague an idea. But my point is that it isn't. It's a fundamental idea. The era of deconstruction should, in my mind, be replaced by an era of construction again. Instead of tearing down the past, we should be making the present. Instead of attacking everything in our history, we should be making history. We should not be telling young people that they are born into this oppression and this guilt and much more. We should be saying, you are born with the greatest lottery ticket you could have had. Not just in global terms, but in historical terms. Take the ticket and run with it as far and as fast as you can and make something of your life. That would be an idea.
Shall we wrap it up?
How can you say something sensible after that?
So, I totally agree. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us tonight. Thank you, Bart De Wever, and thank you for also listening.
Thank you.
Thank you for your
Brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.